My playstyle gets called boring a lot, and before you think this is a video where I defend myself saying that my playstyle is not boring, let me just stop you right there and say, no, I completely agree. It is very boring. The thing is, though, the more efficiently you play in Dark Souls 3, the more boring you are to watch. This is kind of a given. What I am going to argue is that due to how the PvP in this particular game is designed, playing boring is the most successful way to play if you're focused on winning. Now, a common argument against this is, well, not everyone cares about winning, which I find to be a silly argument because of course everyone cares about winning to some extent. Winning has elicited a positive emotional response pretty much since the concept of winning has existed. To put it very simply, if you had to ask someone whether they preferred winning or losing, they would choose winning 100% of the time. Why wouldn't they? So why is it so offensive when people actually try to win? The argument of your build is unfun is you assuming your definition of fun is universal, which doesn't make you a superior and honorable duelist for not touching the meta. It just makes you an asshole who thinks their opinion is law. Now, earlier I said playing boring is effective due to how this game is designed, and I'd like to explain what I mean by that. In a nutshell, Dark Souls 3 has the most shallow PvP out of the Souls games, in my opinion, and please remember those last 3 words. Just because I have a YouTube channel does not mean anything I say is law either. That being said, I found the best players have all been extremely basic in terms of our fights. Spacing, running R1s, regular R1s, that's what most of the fights come down to. This is in part due to how limited the PvP actually is in this game, and these are not things that patches will fix because they would overwrite the entire single-player experience, which they will never do. Things like the insanely low stamina cost of rolls will likely never be touched, so saying it's too early in this game's life cycle to criticize these points isn't really a fair argument. Dark Souls 1 and 2 had a shit ton of tech that was universally useful in almost all builds. Like toggle escapes, the seemingly endless backstab tech in Dark Souls 1, reverse backstabs, backstab parries, animation cancels, quick rolls, running R1s out of rolls. These were all things that were discovered very quickly after the game's respective release. Now, Dark Souls 3 has tech, but they fall more along the lines of, I'm just trying to look fancy rather than having actual practical uses. Now let's take a look at some of the more known tech in Dark Souls 3, and I'll explain how I think they are all almost very situational or dependent on the opponent being a bad player and are really just kind of like desperate grabs to try to make Dark Souls 3 look more deep than it actually is. Now, to be fair, I asked a bunch of really solid or prominent members of the PvP community like Scorbrand, Bao, Elite, Seshil, Banisher, SKSA. They pretty much all agree with the following points, so I'm not alone here. First up, reverse quick steps. Already this technique is extremely situational because it can only be done with like 7 weapons, most of which are actually just awful weapons to begin with because they're daggers and they're a pretty underpowered weapon class. Additionally, this really only works against very slow weapons. Even in this video by Whammy, the guy who publicized the move, all of his examples are on a guy with a very slow giant weapon, which frankly you don't need a quick step to backstab anyway. It's a technique that really only works when you're using an underpowered weapon class while also fighting people that are using an underpowered weapon. That is way too situational to be useful in a duel between 2 good players. The only purpose it serves is looking flashy, which is kind of the overall tone of my argument against all the tech in this game. Next are reverse rolls. Again, they look really cool, and against an opponent that has no idea what they're doing, you can roll backstab them. However, against everything else, the input takes way too long to pull off, and the time spent two-handing and actually pulling it off is too long for the positional advantage for it to actually matter. In this video, again by Whammy, once again, every single backstab is against a pretty slow weapon. He gets one against a red-hilted halberd, but there's a long delay where the opponent is sort of just standing still, and that's not really what would happen in a normal environment, so... To be fair, even Whammy knows it's not that useful. He's even said it in his own comments, so definitely nothing against him. He knows it's not that effective, but people see this, they see its tech, and they think, oh, it's super advanced stuff, we gotta learn it, but, I mean, hell, the discoverer of it knows himself it's not that great, so... Next are reverse backstabs. Now, in Dark Souls 1, they were useful for escaping backstab chains, were also more useful because poise actually existed, and you actually had hyper armor during backstabs. In Dark Souls 2, you had iframe, so you could do the maneuver into an opponent safely if you timed it right. And Dark Souls 3 offers none of these advantages. Reverse backsteps are extremely risky against any decent player, and even when it does work, it only works with a very select few weapons, namely like katanas. Obviously, you don't use this technique as a defensive maneuver in Dark Souls 3, but even as an offensive maneuver, I don't find myself ever getting negatively affected by it. The few examples where it's marginally useful are doing something like an R1 reverse backstep into a running R1 with a katana, as the katana running attack will usually press you far enough to roll catch. Or I can just walk next to them and do the exact same thing and probably hit 2 R1s, which will be more damaging, and it's also safer because I can roll if they don't panic roll after the combo and decide to swing at me. If you backstep immediately after a combo and the opponent knows you like doing that, he's just going to immediately mash you in the face after he gets comboed when you backstep into him. Other than that, there's no real uses for this whatsoever. I've heard counter-arguments that say it's a good way to do an untelegraphed running attack, to which I respond, how the hell is a backstep less telegraphed than the slight change in animation from running to sprinting? If anything, it's way more telegraphed. This is again a technique I consider solely done for the point of being flashy, not for efficiency. Running buffers are probably the only somewhat useful tech I've seen come out of the game in over 3 months. Now, utilized properly, this allows you to stagger a running R1 or make a running R1 come out a bit faster after a different action. Really only the latter method has any reliable use against a good player. The former, where you just sprint up to someone while blocking, is extremely obvious and won't fool a good player. If a guy runs up to you while blocking and then just stands still, you obviously know what's coming, so just back up and throw shit at him until he releases it. It's sad when I consider this to be the only marginally useful tech Dark Souls 3 has, and even this is really not too great in comparison to the tech the previous games have brought. Hell, even the tech I discovered where you can sprint through enemy models to backstab them isn't even that reliable, because it relies on the opponent moving forward before they parry. All of the tech in this game is situational at best and done mostly to just try to impress people, despite what anyone says. The truth of the matter is, Dark Souls 3 doesn't want you to be fancy. It rewards you for being boring and just spacing and doing R1s. I mean, look at the tracking on all weapons. It's ridiculous. There's almost no need to play Unlocked anymore because everything tracks like a heat-seeking missile, meaning you can just mash R1. If an opponent rolls into you, they're gonna get shredded, even if it's a weapon that has no business tracking in a circle like a rapier. Hell, most R2s don't even combo in this game. Why would you bother with an R2 unless it's a drastically different attack like a poke? A common argument is, well, you can change your timings to throw people off, but you can also just delay an R1 and then get a full 2-hit R1 combo for more damage and less risk than a regular R2. Now, people that give you shit for not using R2s on something like the Karthus Curve Sword have either just never used the weapon, or are living in a world where they value looking cool over actually winning, and that's fine. Some people enjoy being flashy, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, if you are that type of player, don't give people who prefer the other method any shit because their opinion of fun isn't any different from yours. It's the same. It doesn't matter how many reverse rolls you do or how many buffered running attacks you do, you cannot ignore the fact that the PvP in this game is very basic compared to the other Souls games. That doesn't mean it's good or bad, but it does mean that giving people shit for being boring when the game itself rewards that boring play just makes you less of a person than those people you're giving shit for winning. If any of the tech in this game was reliably useful against good players, you would see more exciting fights, but unfortunately Dark Souls 3 prefers you just kinda R1 people to death. Thanks for watching, guys, and I know I pissed a lot of you off, but I tried to be as unbrash as possible, but me and a lot of people do feel pretty strongly about the subject. We wish the game was more in-depth, and pretending that it is when it isn't is just, I don't know. It's just, it sucks. I wish there were more to the game, but there really isn't. I still enjoy the hell out of it. I have fun playing it, but let's not pretend that it's more complicated than it actually is, alright?